Today, we are wrestling with, I think, one of the most monumental tensions defining our digital age.
It really is.
It's all about the dual-sided power of artificial intelligence.
Hmm.
And it boils down to this fundamental question for, well, for all of us. Is AI inevitably an engine that's just destined to amplify systemic historical racism and economic disparity?
Or, and this is the hopeful side, can we genuinely engineer it to become a transparent, maybe even a radical tool for social and economic justice?
Exactly. And that tension, it's not just some academic thought experiment.
No, not at all. It is the central conflict that runs through this massive stack of source material. Our mission in this deep dive is really to unpack this conflict. And to do that, we have to look at three distinct interlocking fronts in this battle for accountability.
Three fronts. Okay, let's lay out the roadmap for everyone listening.
So first, we're going to establish the hard facts. We're talking about the data that proves the entrenched reality of algorithmic bias. You know, how these systems actively constrain opportunities for marginalized groups in everything from, say, loan applications to law enforcement.
Okay, so that's the problem.
Then second, we'll look at the massive corporate response. I mean, the multi-million, sometimes billion-dollar commitments to equity coming from the big tech players like Apple, Google, and Netflix will detail exactly where that money's going and why.
And the third front.
And finally, we have to confront the serious structural critiques. These are coming from civil rights and AI justice advocates who argue that, the foundational business models themselves, the ones built on data extraction and surveillance, are the real source of the problem, much more than just some faulty code.
Right. And we have an essential stack of sources to guide us through all this.
Yeah.
It ranges from academic papers that define algorithmic racism and map out that unequal talent pipeline, all the way to these comprehensive diversity and inclusion reports from the biggest names in tech, Microsoft, Google, Apple. They're detailing their financial pledges, their internal metrics.
And we also have the specific, and I have to say, often very sharp policy demands from influential groups like the AI Now Institute and Color of Change.
So it's a complete 360-degree view of the challenge.
Yeah.
And the attempted solutions.
And what this really forces us to confront, and what we really want you, our listener, to consider throughout this deep dive, is the enormous disconnect here.
The disconnect.
Yeah. How do we reconcile these vast financial pledges, hundreds of millions of dollars dedicated to external empowerment, with the persistent documented challenges of digital harm and the continuing systemic lack of internal representation and, frankly, equitable labor practices inside the very companies making these pledges?
That disconnect, that's the central mystery we're trying to solve with the evidence.
It is.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the problem that gave rise to this whole movement. The very real, measurable phenomenon we call algorithmic racism, and how those effects are showing up, both in the products and in the foundational workforce pipeline.
I think we need to anchor ourselves with a really precise definition here. When we say algorithmic racism, we're describing the behavior of technological solutions that constrain users based on their ethnicity.
Right, and that leads to measurable disadvantages.
Measurable disadvantages when they're trying to access essential technology-based services. And this isn't just, a theoretical discrimination. It's a tangible barrier in accessing things like housing, banking, and maybe most critically, law enforcement and justice systems.
And what's particularly striking from the source material, to me at least, is that this isn't some niche academic observation. It's a known quantity inside the industry itself.
That's such a crucial insight. There was a survey of 73 software professionals, and it found the effects of algorithmic racism are, quote, well known among practitioners.
So the people building the systems,
Yeah.
they know.
They know the biases exist. The disturbing part, though, is that despite this awareness, there is, and again I'm quoting, no consensus on how to effectively address the problem within the field of software engineering itself.
Wait, hold on. That sounds almost contradictory.
Yeah.
If you know a tool you built is harming people, why can't the engineers just agree on a fix?
Well, it really speaks to the complexity of the problem. It's not just a bug you can patch with a better line of code.
It's deeper than that.
Much deeper. The professionals, they recognize that the bias originates in historical and societal structures that just permeate the data sets and the design choices. So the most promising solution they proposed isn't purely technical.
Okay.
It's a combination of technical fixes and social strategies. Specifically, they called for mandatory training on structural racism for software professionals.
Wow. So they're admitting that bias doesn't just live in the data set.
Exactly. It lives in the human perspective of the person choosing the data, modeling the system, and deciding what success even looks like for that algorithm.
I think the real weight of this issue hits home when you see the tangible data. And nothing is more tangible, or frankly, more frightening, than the case study of facial recognition bias.
The NIST data, the National Institute of Standards and Technology.
Right. They've investigated this so rigorously.
And that data provides chilling, quantifiable specifics on how these design choices become systemic harm. Their tests consistently show that most face recognition algorithms yield systematically higher false match rates, or FMRs.
Which is a false positive, right? This system wrongly matches one person to another.
Correct. And they found higher FMRs in women than in men, even when using controlled images like mugshots. So that's already a massive accuracy gap just based on gender alone.
But the disparity, it becomes truly shocking when you factor in ethnicity. That's where it really illuminates the intersectional problem.
Absolutely. The data reveals that the highest FMR specifically occurs in images of American Indians. And let's just focus on the staggering difference here. For one featured algorithm, the FMR for American Indian women was found to be 0.00068.
Okay, 0.00068. What does that compare to?
Now, if you compare that to the baseline group in these studies, which is often white males, the FMR was measured at 0.0001.
So wait, that means American Indian women are 68 times more likely to be falsely identified or mismatched than white males.
Yeah.
By the exact same algorithm.
68 times.
I need to pause on that statistic.
Okay.
68. That is not a small, statistically insignificant margin of error. It means if this technology is used in policing, in border security, or even just accessing critical infrastructure, that entire demographic is facing a catastrophic failure rate.
The implications are profound. I mean, just imagine this technology being used to scan a large crowd during a protest.
Or to identify suspects from low-quality camera footage.
Right. If you are an American Indian woman, you're drastically more likely to be incorrectly flagged. And that leads to unjustified stops, detentions, or investigations. This is the definition of a fundamentally broken system for that demographic.
And the sources point out that this isn't just an accidental coding mistake. It's a crucial system design factor that actively hides the problem, isn't it?
Yes, and this is where the engineering decisions become morally complex. The NIST report highlights that most biometric systems operate with a fixed threshold.
Meaning what, exactly?
They set a single level of confidence or probability for everyone in the system, regardless of their demographic group. This fixed threshold, by design, ignores the wild demographic variations we just discussed. It effectively hides these massive excursions in false positive rates, like that 68-fold jump from the operators or designers who are just looking at the top-line system metric.
So the designers choose a one-size-fits-all approach. And because that average works well enough for the largest, most represented demographic, which is often white males, they can technically report high overall accuracy, while at the same time allowing the system to be catastrophically inaccurate for others.
Exactly. The system is designed not to see the bias it is perpetuating. It minimizes the perceived operational friction for the majority while maximizing the potential for harm and injustice for the minority. It's a systemic decision that transforms historical bias in the training data into structural harm during deployment.
So it's not a bug, it's a feature.
In a way, yes. It requires moving beyond a simple technical fix to a fundamental design choice about fairness and equity.
And this issue isn't just about the algorithms, it's about the people building them, training them, deploying them. And that takes us directly to the systemic barriers and the isolation present in the tech workforce pipeline.
Which pretty much guarantees that the majority of engineers designing these systems come from the demographics they happen to work best for.
It's a feedback loop.
It's a powerful one, and the pipeline issues are severe, pervasive, and often intersectional. We see severe underrepresentation, and the data from the UK tech workforce provides a really startling snapshot.
What did that show?
Black women, for example, constitute only more over 7% of the UK tech workforce.
0.07%.
Right. A dramatic contrast compared to their 1.8% representation in the general UK workforce.
That is nearly 25 times lower than their general representation. And, I mean, when you have such a tiny fraction of the workforce from a marginalized group, you inherently lose the lived experience that's necessary to spot a 68-fold error rate for a group like American Indian women.
Precisely. The compounded effects of race and gender, what policymakers call intersectionality, they create these highly restrictive ceilings on opportunity. But the root of the problem, it starts much, much earlier than the hiring stage.
Earlier, meaning K-12 education, right? The common corporate line is often, We can't find the talent, there's a pipeline leak.
Right, but the source material suggests the leak is engineered, not accidental.
What does the research say?
It confirms that. The issue isn't just a lack of interest among students of color. The problem starts right in the K-12 system. Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students face significant social barriers, and these stem from biases held by teachers and administrators.
Like what kind of biases?
It includes documented negative belief systems and just lower expectations of college success for those students.
Can you elaborate on how that actually shows up in a classroom?
It's often through subtle but powerful tracking. Teachers, for example, consistently rate the math proficiency of girls lower than boys, and girls of color lower than white students, and this is regardless of the student's actual performance metrics.
So the grades don't even matter.
The bias overrides the data. And this institutional bias, it hinders achievement and persistence in STEM fields. It steers students of color away from advanced math or science courses early on, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of a pipeline leak years before they even think about college applications.
So even for those who successfully navigate that whole gauntlet, who fight the biases and they make it into the industry, the workplace culture itself presents another just exhausting layer of isolation and psychological burden.
That isolation is a defining theme in the experience of women of color in tech. The sheer lack of diversity means they are constantly operating as the other, which forces individuals to adjust their behavior, often needing to assimilate into a dominant culture that is overwhelmingly white and male. This creates a psychological tax, a constant, exhausting mental overhead.
And the data actually quantifies this emotional burden perfectly.
It really does. A study on workplace bias provided specific, frankly heartbreaking data on the pressure to constantly prove competence. While 2/3 of all women surveyed reported feeling they had to repeatedly prove themselves.
Which is already a high number.
Already very high. But that burden was significantly heavier for Black women. 3/4 of Black women reported that their success was discounted and their expertise questioned.
3/4. That's a 7-point jump in self-doubt directly tied to the intersection of race and gender.
And that data point doesn't even capture the cost of self-imposed isolation. Some women of color report actively choosing isolation just to avoid negative perceptions of their competence.
Which then limits their networking opportunities and visibility.
The very things you need for career advancement. You're punished for trying to assimilate, and you're penalized for not assimilating enough.
It's a truly painful paradox. And this isolation and stagnation, it ultimately leads to what the sources term the salary trap.
The salary trap is a grim but, logical outcome of these structural barriers. Tech jobs, even mid-level ones, they offer good compensation. And that often translates to a quality of life that women of color feel they can't attain elsewhere because of historical and ongoing economic disparities.
Okay, so that makes sense. But where's the trap?
The trap is this. Even when structural barriers, that glass ceiling we mentioned, prevent them from advancing further into senior leadership or executive roles, they remain stuck. They stay because the financial compensation is just too significant to risk walking away from.
So the high pay, which should be a reward for excellence, ironically becomes the very mechanism that sustains their structural stagnation.
Exactly. One African-American IT worker quoted in the sources noted, "I can't go any higher in the organization. There's a glass ceiling at this place, but I can't make this same money anywhere else, so I will probably stay where I am."
Wow.
That individual is financially successful by many metrics, yet structurally blocked from having any real influence. It just highlights that high compensation is not a proxy for equity or influence within an organization.
And if we look beyond just the corporate campus to the global ecosystem, we see how these systemic barriers are even reinforced by institutions outside of tech.
Right.
The difficulties faced by organizations like Black in AI trying to conduct international workshops, that really demonstrates this.
The work of groups like Black in AI, co-founded by pioneers like Ready at a Baby, it's absolutely essential for increasing participation and mitigating data bias. They work to ensure diverse voices are present in these technical discussions.
But their efforts are often actively derailed by global systemic issues, like bureaucracy.
That's a perfect word for it.
Tell us about the Montreal workshop example. That was a really stark case.
Reports indicated that for their 2018 workshop in Montreal, dozens of academics and researchers from Africa and South America were denied visas or were still waiting just weeks before the event.
So they couldn't even attend.
They were prevented from attending or presenting their critical work on AI fairness. And it just underscores that the problem of digital exclusion isn't just in the code or on the corporate campus. It's baked into the global mobility and opportunity structure. When the most passionate experts working on solving algorithmic racism can't even get to the conference.
The systemic barriers are deeply entrenched. That is a powerful point. The barriers aren't technical or academic. They're bureaucratic, structural, and rooted in these global inequities. Okay, let's pivot. In response to these very well-documented issues, the 68-fold error rates, the 0.07% workforce representation, the visa problems, the largest tech corporations have mobilized massive resources. We need to examine what those financial commitments truly represent.
So we're moving directly from this rigorous critique of harm to the large-scale, often multi-million-dollar corporate response. We are seeing incredible sums of money committed both internally for diversity programs and externally for broad economic empowerment.
Let's start with Netflix. Their initiative, focused on financial investment in Black communities, is a really clear, specific commitment that aims to address the wealth gap directly.
Netflix announced a $100 million initiative dedicated to building economic opportunity in Black communities. One of their first, and I think most important, investments under this umbrella was a $10 million transformational deposit in Hope Credit Union.
And Hope is a community development financial institution, a CDFI.
Right, and this is significant because this isn't just a grant, it's a capital inflow that's designed to support lending.
So what makes this approach, the transformational deposit, more impactful than, say, a simple charitable donation?
Transformational deposits are specifically designed to be patient capital. They import funds into capital-starved communities, often areas that traditional banks deem too risky.
And Hope Credit Union uses these deposits to increase their lending capacity for specific needs.
Exactly. Business loans, mortgage financing, consumer loans.
And the impact is designed to be immediate and hyper-local, reaching communities that are often completely ignored by mainstream finance.
Precisely. Over just 2 years, Hope estimates that the Netflix deposit will support financing for more than 2,500 entrepreneurs, homebuyers, and consumers of color. And you have to pause on the contextual detail here because it makes the commitment incredibly potent.
Tell us.
Hope is the only depository institution in several majority Black Mississippi Delta towns like Itabana, where the poverty rate is a staggering 42% and the median household income is just over $20,000.
So Netflix is using its capital to tackle the systemic financial exclusion that is directly related to the historical inequities reflected in biased datasets.
Yes, they're directly confronting the severe net worth gap, where in the Deep South states served by Hope, for every dollar held by white households, Black households hold between 10 and 20 cents. The funding goes toward correcting a historical imbalance, which, if it's successful, could indirectly reduce the bias found in future creditworthiness algorithms.
Google also entered this space with massive financial pledges aimed at addressing racial inequities across job skilling and small business support.
Google committed over $320 million to organizations working on racial inequities. They successfully met their highly publicized $50 million commitment to the Opportunity Finance Network through the Grow with Google Small Business Fund, providing support specifically to Black-owned businesses.
And they're expanding that focus beyond just capital into media and information access, which links back to that democratic participation issue we'll discuss later on.
Absolutely. Google made commitments to increase support for Black media and creators. They plan to increase their spend on Black-owned media by 4 times over a single year.
4 times?
And on top of that, the Google News Initiative launched the Ad Transformation Lab specifically to help Black and Latino news publishers advance their advertising strategies. It gives them the tools to grow digital revenue and compete in the highly capital-intensive digital ad market, a direct countermeasure to the structural disadvantage inherent in tech's business model.
Now, while some companies are investing outside their walls, others have faced criticism for internal financial practices that seem to contradict their external commitments. We saw that note about Facebook and the lack of diversity among their asset managers.
This is a key point where the financial commitments, the massive grants, can clash directly with a company's own internal financial plumbing. Facebook faced strong criticism from the civil rights community regarding the lack of diversity among the firms managing their vast corporate assets.
This came up in congressional testimony, right?
It did. During 2019 testimony, Mark Zuckerberg was questioned about this, and the data showed that of the 10 external investment management firms Facebook worked with at that time, only one was self-identified as female-owned.
And crucially,
None were minority-owned. This highlights a profound gap. A company can write a check for $100 million for external equity while simultaneously channeling billions in internal asset management fees to firms that lack racial diversity.
it's an instance where the company's internal financial ecosystem is fundamentally exclusionary.
Right, and it undermines the very principles it's championing externally.
That disconnect really is the story here. Okay, let's move past the money given away to internal accountability. Financial pledges are great, but what about changing the composition of the people building the algorithms that have those 68-fold error rates?
That's where DEI goals and workforce development come in.
And Microsoft is leading here with some aggressive, measurable targets.
They are, under their Racial Equity Initiative. They pledged to double the number of Black and African American and Hispanic and Latinx people managers, senior individual contributors, and senior leaders in the U.S. by 2025.
And that's important because it focuses not just on entry-level hires,
But on the crucial mid- and senior-level roles where influence and design decisions are actually made.
Are they seeing measurable movement toward those goals?
The data indicates progress, particularly in hiring. Microsoft's recent hires representation for Black and African American employees was 9.5%, which is notably higher than their overall headcount representation of 6.6%.
Okay, so that's a positive trend.
And for Hispanic and Latinx hires, the representation was 11.5% compared to 8.0% headcount representation. So it suggests a deliberate, targeted effort to increase diversity at the entry and mid-levels, consciously feeding that leadership pipeline.
That's positive movement, but is increasing the entry-level proportion enough to double senior leadership in just a few years. I mean, that seems like a difficult metric to meet, given the retention and promotion issues we talked about earlier.
It is ambitious, and that's why internal accountability is so vital. Microsoft also explicitly embedded D&I accountability into every single employee's annual goals through their D&I core priority goals.
So there's not just an HR initiative.
No, it's a metric tied to every manager's success.
Google, meanwhile, doubled down on internal support for employees of color, particularly focusing on retention and progression.
Which speaks directly to the isolation and proving yourself burden we identified in Section 1.
Exactly.
Precisely. Google acknowledged that meaningful, lasting change requires examining all their internal processes, especially retention. So they doubled their retention and progression team to provide designated consultants supporting underrepresented Googlers, with plans to triple that investment by 2022.
Wait, if the company is committing to tripling the size of the team, whose sole job is to help underrepresented employees stay and progress, doesn't that suggest the underlying culture is failing?
Well,
It sounds like they're treating a symptom rather than curing the disease.
that is the core conflict. It indicates high internal friction. While they are rolling out robust fairness checks and performance review processes and trying to improve internal pathways, the fact that such a heavy investment is needed just for retention, just for keeping people who are already hired, suggests that the day-to-day culture, which leads to isolation and burnout, remains hostile.
So the money committed to retention is necessary because the systemic barriers are still that intense.
The isolation, the proving yourself burden, yes.
And outside of the corporate walls, these companies are also trying to broaden access to computer science education itself.
Right, which circles back to counteracting the K-12 teacher bias and university pipeline problem.
And we see specific training initiatives aimed at creating alternative, more inclusive pathways.
We do. Facebook, for instance, offers the Align program with Northeastern University, which helps non-computer science graduates, especially those from traditionally underrepresented groups, transition careers.
Which is crucial because it disrupts the reliance on those traditional, narrow CS degree pathways.
It does. They also offer the Above and Beyond CS program, which is a 10-week boot camp preparing underrepresented college students for the highly technical interviews that are often a huge barrier in tech hiring. It's a direct attempt to level the playing field.
That addresses the talent pipeline. But what about the ownership side? Supporting diverse entrepreneurs and creators, especially since the tech ecosystem is so often rigged against small, minority-owned businesses.
Apple has made significant strides here. They're focusing on both investment and cultural preservation through their Racial Equity and Justice Initiative. They're using their capital as a strategic investment in the future of the ecosystem.
How so?
Through their partners, they support firms like Vamos Ventures, a fund where 85% of their portfolio companies are led by Latinx founders. The goal is to help these businesses build generational wealth and influence.
And they're also a partner in Collab Capital.
Yes, a fund explicitly focused on investing in Black founders to disrupt intergenerational inequity.
And Collab Capital's mission seems to be aimed directly at fixing the financial ecosystem itself.
It is. As one of the co-founders noted, they wanted to be the investors they didn't have. Not just supplying capital, but redefining success and ownership structures, ensuring that Black founders have a real seat at the table, not just a small grant.
Apple is also linking these initiatives to cultural and linguistic equity, which goes beyond standard diversity metrics. It sounds like they're consciously using technology for cultural preservation, not just for profit.
This is perhaps the most unique component of Apple's response. On the corporate spend side, their Supply Chain Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, or CI program, proactively sources goods and services from Black, Hispanic, Latinx, and Indigenous-owned companies.
And this is quantifiable, systemic change.
It is. Apple was the first Silicon Valley company accepted into the Billion-Dollar Roundtable, a group celebrating companies that spend $1 billion or more with minority and women-owned businesses.
So they're using their massive purchasing power to redistribute wealth.
Exactly. But the cultural work is equally resonant. Apple supports programs like the Black Film Institute at Simmons College of Kentucky, a historically Black college and university.
And the goal there.
It's profound to use storytelling for activism and to resurrect untold narratives about the Black experience. It's turning art into a catalyst for justice and change.
And the indigenous language work is a direct example of technology counteracting historical oppression.
It is a powerful use of tech as a tool for preservation, recognizing the importance of language in preserving culture, where, as one Cherokee Nation leader noted, hearing the last fluent speaker pass away means hearing a way of life ending.
Wow.
Apple partnered with the Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations to add their indigenous languages to the iOS keyboard. This technology makes those languages visible, accessible, and teachable in the digital age, fighting the homogenization pressures that technology so often imposes.
So we've established this duality. On one side, quantitative proof of algorithmic racism and structural exclusion. On the other, these overwhelming financial and programmatic corporate responses aimed at mitigating these issues. But now we had to turn to the advocacy community and hear why, despite all this money and effort, the $100 million deposits, the tripling of retention teams, they still argue the core system is fundamentally flawed and must be regulated.
The critique from organizations like the AI Now Institute fundamentally shifts the conversation. They argue that focusing on specific flawed algorithms or internal DEI metrics is just treating the symptoms.
And so the disease.
They focus instead on the underlying business model of dominant tech firms, arguing that this model itself is the structural driver of inequity.
Okay, let's unpack that. If the model is data collection for targeted advertising, how does that automatically create and exacerbate racial disparities?
According to AI, now, the reliance on user data collection for ad targeting actively exacerbates existing racial disparities across 4 critical dimensions. It essentially monetizes societal harm.
4 dimensions.
Yeah.
Let's start with democratic participation, which is a massive claim.
First, democratic participation. The sophisticated, highly customizable structure of the targeted advertising system allows for targeted mis- and disinformation to spread virally. This mechanism, designed for customized sales pitches, gets repurposed to specifically impede access to democratic processes for communities of color.
And they cite specific examples.
They do, from the 2016 and 2020 U.S. presidential elections, where specific groups were targeted with messages designed to suppress their vote or spread distrust.
So the incredible precision that makes a targeted ad effective, finding the exact audience for a new pair of shoes, is the same precision that makes political manipulation so frighteningly effective.
Exactly. And this infrastructure is built and maintained by companies that are simultaneously funding democracy initiatives. It's the ultimate conflict.
Okay, what's the second dimension?
Second, they focus on equitable access to goods and services. The computational infrastructure and the advertising components of these models lead to the exclusion of communities of color from crucial digital services. It also enables racial targeting and disinformation campaigns related to things like housing, employment, or finance.
Wait, how does that exclusion happen? Aren't these services universally available online?
Exclusion happens both overtly, through racist ad targeting practices like using proxies for race, say a ZIP code, to deny visibility for housing ads, for example.
Digital redlining.
It's digital redlining. And it happens subtly. When computational models fail to accurately categorize or serve certain communities, often due to the data biases we discussed at the very beginning.
The third point focuses on entrepreneurship and ownership, which seems to cut directly against the massive Google and Apple capital injections we just heard about.
That's ownership and entrepreneurship. If dominant tech companies control the digital marketplaces and can prioritize their own products, or the products of businesses that can afford steep advertising costs, it automatically disadvantages small businesses and entrepreneurs of color who just can't compete in that highly capital-intensive arena.
So you might give a small business a $5,000 grant, but if the cost to acquire a customer on that platform is $100,000, you haven't really solved the structural barrier.
You haven't touched it.
Did the advocacy pressure lead to any material changes in ad policy?
Yes. Advocacy groups urged compliance with civil rights laws and EEOC regulations to prevent this racist ad targeting. And Facebook, to its credit, did update its ad policy.
How so?
They now require U.S. advertisers running credit, housing, or employment ads to self-identify as a special ad category. And this designation applies specific restrictions to prevent discriminatory targeting based on proxies like ZIP codes, age, or gender. It recognizes the legal liability in these high-stakes categories.
And the fourth dimension relates to labor, which ties back into the workforce representation and isolation issues from Section 1.
That is worker power, worker voice, and access to good jobs. The AI Now Institute argues that the labor practices of large tech companies create an engineered labor divide that pushes workers of color into lower-paid, precarious tech jobs where they are subject to constant surveillance and instability.
And this brings us to the crucial concept of workforce fissuring.
Workforce fissuring. It sounds like stratification, a two-tiered system where the wealth flows up to the core and all the risk flows down to the periphery.
It is a profound stratification, and it's based on race, class, and gender, and it defines modern tech labor.
Sure.
At the top, you have the core workforce, the software developers, the engineers, the architects.
Who are predominantly white and male.
Right. They earn high salaries, often exceeding $200,000 a year, with full protections like stock options, paid leave, and job stability.
And who occupies the bottom tier, the precarious periphery?
Conversely, Black, Indigenous, and Latinx people, women, and non-binary people are drastically overrepresented as contract or gig workers. These roles involve essential but often invisible tasks: content moderation, data labeling for AI training, physical security, custodial work.
And the pay.
Crucially, 75% of those contract workers are in the lowest paid 25th percentile of the tech sector workforce. The racial disparities in pay and employment in this sector are more severe than in other private industries.
That is a staggering contrast. So while the visible face of these companies is pushing diversity goals for high-paying, full-time managerial roles like the 9.5% Black hires at Microsoft, the invisible backbone of the labor force is overwhelmingly low-wage, contracted workers of color.
And they don't even show up on the company's official diversity reports.
This invisibility is a central part of the business model, and this low-wage workforce is often subjected to aggressive workplace surveillance, a key element intended to make this labor less visible and less organized.
So the technology we use to track productivity and optimize supply chains is being actively weaponized against low-wage workers of color.
That's the argument. We have documented reports of Amazon planning to buy software specifically to track union-building efforts in Whole Foods whose workers are disproportionately people of color.
And Google.
Similarly, Google faced a ruling requiring it to turn over documents concerning a program that was set up to obstruct workplace activism. The technology that underpins the entire AI revolution is being used not just for efficiency or for ad revenue, but for labor control and union busting among marginalized labor pools.
This speaks directly to the barriers to entry we mentioned earlier. If the existing workforce is so heavily stratified and the majority of high-salary jobs are going to a small demographic, how are people of color supposed to get access to those core engineering jobs in the first place?
Part of the problem lies in outdated and biased hiring methodologies that just reinforce existing social networks. Studies show a heavy reliance on elite university recruitment.
Right.
70% of businesses are likely to hire from top-ranked universities, despite those institutions often having their own documented diversity challenges. This reliance creates an immediate systemic barrier for highly competent talent coming from alternative pathways, like HBCUs or less prestigious institutions.
There's a powerful social science analogy here,
Uh-huh.
often cited regarding how successful bias removal can be if the company is willing to actually try.
Yes, the example of symphony orchestras is often brought up. When they adopted blind screening for musicians, using a screen to ensure anonymity and basing selection solely on audition results, the percentage of non-white applicants chosen for interviews jumped dramatically,
From what to what?
from 20% to 60%. The tech industry, given its emphasis on evaluating reproducible work or code, is theoretically perfectly suited to adopt similar blind screening approaches. Evaluating code challenges or projects anonymously. Yet the bias persists through these conventional elite recruitment channels.
So the ultimate conclusion from the advocates, then, is that the corporate response, while commendable in its charitable aims, like the Netflix deposits or the Google grants, is fundamentally just treating the symptoms.
That's the argument, that the underlying profit model of data extraction, targeted advertising, and stratified labor continues to perpetuate the disease. And that brings us to the final necessary discussion: governance. If the industry can't or won't fix the fundamental structural issues of its business model and labor practices, what policies are being proposed to enforce accountability and mandate equitable design?
To tackle the issue of algorithm trustworthiness, the government has stepped in with frameworks like the NIST AI Risk Management Framework, or AI RMF. What's the core philosophy here, and how does it address the human element of bias?
The AI RMF is designed to increase the trustworthiness of AI systems by helping organizations manage risk across the entire AI lifecycle. And the core philosophy acknowledges that risks stem not just from technical faults, but fundamentally from human cognitive and systemic biases that get introduced during design, modeling, and deployment.
And these biases are then exacerbated by system opacity.
Right, which is why transparency and explainability are so central to the framework. The goal is to create a systemic process that forces designers to look for the bias they may not even realize they introduce.
So it forces the discussion away from just aggregate accuracy toward targeted harm.
Exactly. And NIST has also specifically addressed the new risks posed by generative AI, or GAI, which is dominating the tech conversation right now.
How do the risks change when AI is creating rather than just classifying?
The NIST GAI report identifies several key risks, including data privacy, dangerous and hateful content, and crucially for our discussion, harmful bias and homogenization.
Homogenization. What does that look like in practice?
It refers to GAI producing overly uniform or repetitive outputs that fail to reflect the complexity and diversity of the real world, which can actively amplify existing harmful biases.
Can you give an example?
Sure. If a large language or image foundation model is skewed, say it's trained primarily on images of white people in professional roles, every subsequent model built on it becomes a bottleneck that transmits and amplifies that bias. It makes diverse representation harder and harder to achieve in the generated output.
This push for trustworthiness and equity in design is mirrored in high-level federal guidelines like the AI Bill of Rights,
Yes.
which lays out explicit, non-negotiable protections for users dealing with automated systems.
The AI Bill of Rights establishes core principles, making it clear that individuals should not face discrimination by algorithms, and that systems must be designed and used equitably. This moves the issue of algorithmic racism from an academic critique to a policy mandate.
Let's detail the three most relevant principles for our listener. First, the Algorithmic Discrimination Protections Principle.
This is the foundation. It mandates that users should not face discrimination based on their protected characteristics. And it says systems must be designed equitably, and that independent evaluation, like disparity testing using demographic data, should be performed and made public whenever possible,
Especially in high-stakes areas.
especially in areas like credit or education.
Second, the focus on data privacy.
This principle directly challenges that core business model of data extraction we critiqued in Section 3. It demands protection from abusive data practices be built into the system by design, ensuring individuals have agency over how data about them is used.
So it recognizes the risks of massive data collection.
Exactly, especially for low-income and marginalized communities.
And finally, the right to explanation.
Users must know exactly how and why an outcome that impacts them was determined by an automated system. And the explanations have to be technically valid, meaningful, and useful to the user, particularly when the system is making high-stakes decisions like determining eligibility for housing, credit, or parole.
Without explanation, there is no appeal.
And no accountability.
The next step, then, is mandating that policymakers and institutions proactively incorporate these concepts, particularly the concept of intersectionality, into how they distribute resources and set goals.
This is absolutely crucial for fixing the pipeline problem. Government efforts addressing underrepresentation in tech have to intentionally account for intersectionality, the unique, compounded experiences of women who hold multiple marginalized identities.
So data collection needs to be disaggregated.
Rigorously disaggregated by both race, ethnicity, and gender.
That means we can't just look at women in tech or people of color in tech. We need to see Black women, Latinx men, Indigenous women specifically, to pinpoint where the barriers really are.
Exactly. Simply using aggregate categories hides the severity of the problem, as that 0.07% Black women in UK tech data point so starkly proved. Disaggregated data is the first step toward equitable policy intervention.
This calls for federal agencies to act as powerful incentive structures, making diversity metrics central to their funding decisions.
They should leverage their financial power. They must incentivize institutions through stringent accountability measures. For prospective grantees, universities, research labs, contractors, their DEI plans should be reviewed and used as a determining factor in awarding or renewing funding.
Not just a checkbox exercise.
No. And furthermore, federal agencies should carry out periodic equity audits for grantee institutions to ensure they are taking a culturally responsive, intersectional approach to addressing disparities, thereby leveraging government funding to force structural change in the educational pipeline.
Finally, let's detail the most structural and often most controversial policy demands from the advocacy groups we mentioned earlier, like the AI Now Institute and Color of Change.
They are calling for a total system transformation,
moving beyond compliance to fundamentally changing the rules of the road.
These groups demand a complete shift in approach. They recognize that the current regulatory landscape often operates from a race-blind perspective, which is just insufficient to reverse historical harm. First, they argue that legislation must be Black-centered from the start.
Not just seeking technical assistance later.
Right. They want racial equity centered in all technology regulatory efforts.
What specific actions are they demanding related to harmful technology and corporate liability, particularly for surveillance tech?
They want clear guidelines developed to inform when harmful technology should be banned, outright imposing moratoria on technologies that disproportionately harm low-income people and people of color. The argument is that if a technology fails, like facial recognition does, it should be pulled from high-stakes deployment.
And for surveillance.
Crucially, addressing the surveillance issue in Section 3, they want to shift the burden of proof for violating worker protections from the individual employee to the corporation. If surveillance tech is used, the corporation should bear the responsibility of proving it isn't being used to obstruct unionization or to discriminate.
And regarding the workforce stratification, that fissuring we discussed in detail.
The demand is clear. Ban the use of automated technologies in the hiring and firing of workers, especially in areas of employment status, scheduling, and pay. They require mandatory human oversight for all high-stakes decisions related to employment status.
So the core argument here is that the goal shouldn't just be to make AI less racist in theory.
No. It must be to fundamentally change the corporate behavior that enables racism to flourish in the first place, from the opaque algorithms it produces to the stratified labor structure it relies on. #outro.
This has been a necessary, complex, and I think at times a frustrating deep dive. We started by quantifying the reality of algorithmic racism, evidenced by that 68-fold higher false match rate for American Indian women in deployed facial recognition systems.
Right.
We then reviewed the massive public corporate investments aimed at mitigating these issues. Netflix's strategic capital injection into Hope Credit Union, Google's $320 million commitment to equity, and Apple's dual focus on diverse entrepreneurs and essential indigenous cultural preservation.
But we've constantly had to balance that against the sharp, powerful critiques from advocates. We've seen a pervasive dual narrative. Big tech is dedicating enormous resources to fixing the external symptoms, funding HBCUs, diversifying entry-level talent pools.
While the critics convincingly argue that the internal infrastructure, the core business model built on pervasive data extraction, targeted advertising, and stratified, surveilled labor, is the root cause of the inequity.
Yeah, and that it's actively undermining those external investments.
It leaves us with a truly provocative thought to close on, one for you to mull over long after this deep dive ends. If algorithmic bias, as the NIST Framework suggests, is fundamentally a reflection of historical and systemic human bias, can we truly achieve digital equity? a world where the code treats everyone fairly, without first fundamentally dismantling the exclusionary structures of the tech industry itself.
Both in the opaque, self-serving algorithms it produces.
And the highly stratified, often invisible jobs it creates. That is the structural work that lies ahead for both policymakers and technologists.